Hello, welcome to those of you that have joined already. We're going to be getting started in a couple of moments. We'll give people a little bit more time to join. Hey everyone, welcome. We're just going to give people about another minute to join before we get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your location. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Our webinar is being recorded and will be shared in a follow-up email to registrants as well as on our landing page. The chat will be open and we'll be sharing key points throughout the webinar. However, we're unlikely to have time to answer specific questions. Please do include any questions you have in the chat box and we'll be happy to follow up with you after the webinar. Next slide. Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Welton. I'm so happy to have you all here today. Just a quick run of show. I'm going to introduce Samir Gadkari, our president, in just a moment, who's going to provide some welcoming comments. And then I'm going to welcome Dr. Lily Massa-McKinley and Ruben Canedo. I will do their full introductions after Samir is done speaking. And then it'll come back to me and we'll do a deep dive on our SNAP Reimagined analysis. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Samir.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you all for joining us today. It's nice to see so many familiar names and faces. I'm Samir Gadkari. I'm the president of TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's working to make college more affordable, to improve college access and completion, to protect students and taxpayers from fraud, waste, and abuse in the higher education system, and to increase racial and economic mobility from our higher education system. And we do our work at the federal level with federal policymakers and in states and across the country, but particularly in California and Michigan. My thanks to those of you who work closely in that work with us. And one of the big areas that we have long worked on since the inception of TICAS is the harms, the perils, the challenges created by student debt, and the need for us to increase college affordability on the front end when students are enrolling, such that they do not need to take out debts that will imperil their economic futures, harm them. And as a result, we are working towards building the path to debt-free college, reducing the need for students to borrow in the first place through college affordability. As part of that endeavor and part of restoring higher education as a system that promotes economic mobility and racial equity, we know that we need to meet the costs of attendance that not only encompass tuition and fees, but also students' basic needs. And so I've been really excited about the work that Carrie is building out at TICAS to help us think about how we meet those basic needs through federal and state policy, and how we support students so that they don't need to take on debt and can enroll and complete a college program that will leave them better off. I'm excited about today's brief and topic. We think that it's essential to help SNAP recipients go through a college degree, and also to support college students in getting access to SNAP and meeting their basic needs. And so I'm thrilled to turn it over to Carrie to talk more about that and our distinguished panel today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samir. That was great. Really appreciate it. I'd like to introduce first Ruben Canedo. Ruben is the Director of Strategic Equity Initiatives within UC Berkeley's Division of Equity Inclusion. His responsibilities include research, organizing, and advocacy. And he was appointed to the dual roles of Chair of the UC Berkeley Basic Needs Committee 2012 and co-chair of the UC System-Wide Basics Need Committee 2013. Last academic year, 21-22, the UC served 72,213 unique undergraduate and graduate students across their basic needs efforts. And this was the highest population served in 8 years of the UC basic needs efforts. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Lily Massa-McKinley. Lily is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative at the Kentucky Council on Postsecondary Education. Lily has worked in higher education for 20 years at public, private, 2- and 4-year institutions in an array of areas. In her role with the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative, Lily leads the Student Basic Needs Equity Audit focused on increasing access to basic needs supports for students and increasing access to post-secondary education for individuals receiving public benefits. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ruben to get us started.
Thank you so much for that introduction, y'all. My name is Ruben. I use he, they pronouns. I am currently in San Diego, California at the Housing California Conference, and really excited to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation. I do want to begin by sharing my deepest and sincerest gratitude to this generation of TICAS leadership who have really lifted anti-poverty and basic needs efforts in this new iteration of TICAS and the visioning of the future of this organization. We always celebrate TICAS as the historical organization that has really brought a lot of justice centering to this work. And when we were starting our basic needs efforts in California, now over 10 years ago, it was a lot of the TICAS materials in the California Coalition for an Affordable Higher Education Trajectory that was one of our first champions of this work. So it's my honor and privilege to share quality time here with you all today. So with that, I'm going to kick us off in these 5 to 10 minutes that we've been invited to lift some of our lessons and strategies from California. I wanted to really focus on 3 key messages for you all today. The 3 messages for you all are the following. Number 1, basic needs is not just a feel-good effort in higher education. This is something that over the last 10 years of our work, we have confirmed it to be in direct relationship with every single metric of success of higher education, and we'll get into that today. Number 2, we're not going to food pantry our way out of hunger or poverty. This is a systemic design that needs systemic change strategies. And number 3, there's enough no energy in this area that we need to bring the yes energy of possibilities, curiosities, organizing, and community-centered efforts. So for the first message here with you all, what we wanted to lift was we wanted to lift that basic needs is in direct relationship with the metrics of success of higher education. Ooh, can we click one more time on this slide? It seems like it got animated for some reason. Look at that fanciness. Okay, so what we wanted to lift for you all is the UC system has launched a open source and democratic dashboard that you can have access to. You can Google it, super simple, UC Info Center, Student Basic Needs. And the last tab is the completion tab. And what we are lifting here for you all is to recognize that the first year retention rates, the completion or graduation rates, and the academic performance of students fluctuates depending on whether or not we are meeting their basic needs. So we know that students that have their basic needs met, in particular, their food and their housing needs met, historically have performed better in first-year retention, persistence, performance, and completion rates. So when we're having this conversation, and we often hear pushback from people to say, you know, this is really an individual's or personal responsibility to figure out their life and to make sure that they can feed themselves, help themselves, and take care of themselves. And if not, they probably should reconsider whether or not they belong in higher education, so on and so forth. Maybe some of us have heard the narrative that struggling through higher education is a rite of passage and that it's developmentally beneficial for our students. And we're here to bring a little bit of healing justice to that conversation and to say previous generations that struggle with their basic needs are owed an apology, and they shouldn't have had to struggle in their basic needs. And we have the opportunity as a current and emergent generation of higher education community members, directly and indirectly committed to college students, to recognize the fact that this is not just an individual responsibility, this is a community responsibility, an institutional responsibility, a segmental, and really a national one. That the investment here is to lift the fact that student basic needs have a relationship with the metrics of success of our communities. And the more that we invest and improve the basic needs experiences of our students, the better the holistic metrics of success and the outcomes of our student experiences at large. The second message here is that we're not going to food pantry our way out of hunger, poverty, and the equity gaps in higher education. So what I wanted to lift here for you all is the common areas that are lifted when we have this conversation around SNAP, CalFresh, and the significance of their role in our students' trajectories. Number one is food pantries. They are absolutely essential, and we cannot have them as our only intervention in this effort. Food pantries are essential, but they do not prevent hunger. And it's highly, highly labor and operationally intensive year-round. SNAP and CalFresh, in California, we address SNAP as CalFresh for those of us that are outside of California. It's essential, and it's a scalable intervention that can support some students to prevent their total count of visits, or actually their visits, period. That it prevents them from needing the food pantry because they have access to grocery resources on a monthly basis, that they can buy their groceries and keep them from needing the pantry because they have access to that at whatever point they need it. We also often hear about meal plans, and then maybe we can just add 1 or 2 meal plans for those colleges that have the privilege of having dining halls. But we just need to clarify for folks that adding 1 or 2 meal plans, 1 or 2 meals to the meal plan, oftentimes has 2 things that are left out of the conversation. Number one, it can take students over the amount of meals that they can have and therefore disqualifies them for SNAP and CalFresh. And also the fact that adding 1 or 2 meals per week is not equal to the amount of meals that the student can get if and when they are enrolling in CalFresh. So the math there needs to be intentional about saying the best of intentions of saying, maybe we can just add a meal or 2 actually has negative implications, because SNAP and CalFresh is a significantly better resource than just a minimal addition of per week meals added to our students. And lastly, the scholarship conversation, that maybe we can just fundraise for more scholarships for the students that are hungry, when actually just looking at some numbers from our own campus, these are UC Berkeley numbers, there's an estimated 12,000 students at UC Berkeley that are potentially eligible for CalFresh. Let's say that those students receive $200 per month. Over 12 months, that's $28.8 million that we would have to have our development team fundraise. I'm pretty sure that they would feel strongly about adding an additional $28.8 million fundraising to their portfolio, and we would not be the favorite people of that team should they receive that expectation, especially when these funds are already available in the SNAP budget. California in particular provides the highest amount of federal taxes to the federal government, yet we often rank in the bottom or near the bottom of enrolling our population in California into SNAP. And lastly, I just wanted to lift for you all that this is an emerging area where academic publications and research is being published and developed, where people are continuously starting to learn what is really going on in the day-to-day lives of our students and the day-to-day life of our social workers, and what are some things that are helping us and what are some barriers that are keeping us from improving this ecosystem at large that will benefit the student by providing them this essential resource that then is directly connected to the metrics of success of higher education. And lastly, y'all, the third message here, there's a lot of no energy. There's a lot of reasons why to say, no, we can't do this. This isn't our job. We don't have capacity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where we started in California. There was a lot of that no energy, but we continue to organize. We continue to bring people together. We reached out and received invitations to be in spaces like anti-poverty coalitions, anti-hunger coalitions, social services gatherings to introduce ourselves, lift the data of students struggling with poverty, hunger, houselessness, and the promises that were made to them that their lives would be improved once they access higher education and beyond our colleges and universities, and that promise not being fulfilled. And since 2010 to present, we are very lucky that in California, folks have joined this call for organizing and lifted that advocacy to the point that we now have the UC Regents, which is the governing board of the UC system, lifting this as a segmental priority, which makes it a priority for our campuses. We worked with our governor's office and our partners across community colleges, state universities, research universities, coalition and advocacy members to make this a priority for the government of California at large. And this work has been lifted to be in conversation with the national strategies that most recently got lifted in the Biden-Harris administration strategies in this work. And there's a national coalition of folks that are doing this work, many of you that are in this call. So shout out to the community that is here. TICAS being a major champion of this as well. And I'm showing here for you all just the data of, you see the significant growth of enrollment numbers that has happened in California for the UC system, not just for the undergraduate, but also the graduate population, as an affirmation that when we lift this, center this, prioritize our relationship and our organizing, we can improve the relationships, the direct services, the policies, and the systemic designs that allow for us to better support our students and in turn support their experiences of health, well-being, belonging, performance, and completion from higher education. So we just wanted to open up this conversation today with y'all, lifting some of the lessons learned strategies out of California to help frame that and energize this conversation at large. And in closing, y'all, thank y'all so much to TICAS for investing in this area. Congratulations on the phenomenal publication of Reimagining SNAP. And we're excited to continue to organize and to build this powerful intergenerational, local to state to national movement towards bringing belonging, equity, and justice to our students. Thank you all so much for my time. Passing the mic back to you all.
Thank you so much, Ruben. That was fantastic. And I'm going to hand it over to Lily to share her information and insights from Kentucky.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Ruben. It is so great to always just get to hear what all the amazing things that you all are doing in California. Thank you, Samir and Carrie, both for having me to be a part of this. So my name is Lily Mass-McKinley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative, which is an initiative of Kentucky's Council on Postsecondary Education. Our initiative launched about a year and a half ago, and our mission is really to help accelerate the progress on student success of all of our campuses in Kentucky. That includes our 2 years and our 4 years, our public and our private. So we are working in collaboration. As we began our listening tour and kind of meeting with our campus partners, student basic needs emerged as the #1 priority. That was both a priority and a challenge that our campuses were dealing with. We were very fortunate to kind of at the perfect moment, if you could advance to the next slide, be invited to participate in an equity audit project with some modest funding from the Lumina Foundation so that we could dive deeper into understanding our basic needs context of our students in Kentucky. So this is just a little graphic of what our project has entailed. It started in June of 22. We have a very strong and powerful longitudinal data system in Kentucky called KY-STAT. It connects our K-12 data with our higher education data, our employment and earnings data, as well as our Cabinet for Health and Family Services data. So we were able to dive deep and really see across our enrolled students in Kentucky, what percent are receiving a Pell Grant, what percent are receiving a public benefit. And we noticed a pretty significant gap in those two numbers, just kind of as an opportunity for further digging. We were also able to connect and look at the retention and the completion rates and the earnings 1 year after graduation of individuals that were receiving public benefits while enrolled in a post-secondary program. We also knew that it would be really important to understand the campus experience. So we had 3 faculty researchers that worked together from 3 different universities in Kentucky, and they did an asset map of all basic needs programs that were easily accessible from a website so that a student could discover that these resources existed. They then met with program administrators at 9 of our campus partners and said, so this is what we see are available for students online. Tell us a little bit more about the resources that actually exist. And one of their early findings is that there's a pretty big disconnect between what students can access and learn online and what actually are the resources available on campus. Those faculty are also in the middle of doing student focus groups right now. So we'll have 18 focus groups with our students to talk about their awareness of resources as well as their experience accessing support. TICAS, led by Carrie Welton, was able to do a policy scan in Kentucky to help identify opportunities for kind of interpretation and reaching some of those maximum guidelines around interpretation of our own policies within the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So that's been a really important partnership that we have been working on. And then finally, those 3 pieces all kind of took place in the summer and fall. And this January, we launched an action network, which is a collaborative action approach to solving complex social problems together. So we have several state agencies, including our Cabinet for Health and Family Services, our data team, our CPE, our Council on Post-Secondary Education, plus our campus representatives, student voice, community partners, nonprofit organizations, and coalitions. And so our charge right now is to really understand all of these different elements of our basic needs approach in Kentucky, our basic needs landscape, and make recommendations for improved access over the next several years. Next slide. So as a part of our work on this project, we did some pretty extensive research so that we could make a compelling case for why our basic needs such an important factor. We know in Kentucky that over half of our students are struggling to have their basic needs met. We also know that this is making them choose, between continuing in their classes and their education and their career goals, or paying their bills and supporting their family. We also know that students of color are more likely to experience basic needs insecurity and are less likely to seek support compared to their white peers with the same challenges. These basic needs insecurities often lead to extensive mental and emotional harm and most definitely impact academic success and retention. Some consequences include dropping a class, more likely to fail a class, and when students do pause their education for financial reasons, just 20% will eventually graduate. Looking at our Kentucky data, we understand that basic needs insecurity impacts students from all income areas, but specifically those students who are least likely to have a the social or economic network to help support them in times of a financial emergency are those students who are receiving a Pell Grant. In our community and technical college system, that's about 60% of all of our students. And while the employment and earning outcomes are very strong for graduates of our community college system, we have seen a pretty significant decline in enrollment among our students with low income since the beginning of the pandemic. This is a trend that we are working very hard to reverse. Through our longitudinal data system, we are able to connect a lot of these dots that shows really promising outcomes that is good for the student, it's good for our universities, and it's good for our economy and our state. Approximately 14% of our community college students receive SNAP or another public benefit. And that's out of the roughly 60% of students that have that Pell eligibility. We are working really hard, and that'll be one of our recommendations, to focus on how do we help close this SNAP gap. We also see that there are great economic returns, and that of our individuals who graduate with their associate degree and they were receiving SNAP benefits during their education, 80% or more are either re-enrolled and continuing their education within 1 year, or earning more than 200% of the federal poverty line, which we know is just an upward economic trajectory when you combine that credential with more work experience. Specifically, the other end of this pipeline is looking at our current SNAP population. And there's roughly 450,000 individuals in Kentucky that are receiving SNAP benefits. And of those, only 8% have a college credential. So we are going to be really working hard with our community partners, with our Department for Community-Based Services, to increase access to post-secondary education for those individuals that are receiving public benefits and are looking for additional employment and training opportunities to increase their financial self-sufficiency. Next slide. So in Kentucky, we have a bold goal that 60% of our population will hold a post-secondary degree or credential by 2030. And we are working very hard to remove financial barriers and investing in the basic needs support for our students. That is to increase both access to basic needs supports for our current students, and also increase access to post-secondary education for individuals receiving state supports. So thank you for allowing Kentucky to kind of share a little bit about where we are in our process as we are working very hard with TICAS to improve the opportunities for our individuals.
Thank you so much, Lily. And I know Ruben had to jump off for another meeting, but also huge shout out to Ruben for his contributions. And it's so important, particularly I feel like in the federal advocacy space, that we center the experiences of people at institutions in states. And I'm fortunate to be able to do both federal advocacy and technical assistance. Next slide, please, which has strongly informed our policy recommendations, because we know that it is the complexity of the post-secondary restrictions in SNAP that are one of the largest issues. And so today we'll talk a little bit about, the why do we think about SNAP through TICAS's lens, and I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. And then we'll unpack a little bit more data about who SNAP participants are, and how do we think about need in higher education versus how do we think about need in SNAP. And then we'll look at a couple of specific exemptions and what the data say about what students could potentially be benefiting from them, or who could be benefiting from them that may not already be. And then we'll talk a little bit about our policy recommendations. So TICAS's approach, similar to Kentucky's, is broader than thinking about student basic needs. We know that removing SNAP restrictions on education can increase college access and completion and improve self-sufficiency. But what we feel like has been missing from this conversation is understanding that people who are on SNAP and other public programs can and should have access to post-secondary credentials as a way to improve their own economic stability and security. And it is equally important that we ensure students who are enrolled have access to SNAP, but unless we address both sides of this, we're never going to accomplish the full scope of goals that we have in this work. And we know that we have a 60% national attainment rate, and states have been making a lot of strides on these efforts, but we still have a significant way to go. So when we think about, next slide, please. So when we think about what does that mean for the future, we know that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics is now predicting that occupations requiring more education for entry will grow faster than average. And we can see that among that non-credential group, that's about 8.5% predicted from 2021 to 2031, while among the post-secondary non-degree award to associate's and bachelor's degree, there's a 23.7% growth expected. So currently our structure of federal programs focuses on employment and training. And that includes the SNAP employment and training program, the restrictions on education in SNAP, as well as the other programs that TICAS is focused on, including the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, cash assistance, what we traditionally think of as welfare, as well as federal child care subsidies. And we have this whole host of other programs in this country that include WIOA, Department of Labor programs that spend about $20 billion annually on employment and training activities that exclude or limit post-secondary education. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have found little to no demonstrable effects in these programs, with an Obama administration report from 2014 identifying that a post-secondary degree or industry recognized credential goes the furthest to increase workers' lifetime earnings and incomes. And on the other side, a report from the Trump administration's Council on Economic Advisors identified that there's a question on the table of whether or not these various programs that focus on employment and training justify their cost. So really thinking about, if we have a host of federal and state programs that support people with low income, why wouldn't they also support access to post-secondary credentials? And this is really how we think about not only the student basic needs work, but ensuring that people on public programs can access post-secondary credentials. And we know that student basic needs insecurity continues to be a large issue and has grown in attention with good reason. Over 50% of students enrolling now have incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line. So we can see in academics year 11 and 12 and 15 and 16, students at 200% below the federal poverty line are enrolling at rates and higher in their middle and upper income peers. And this is why we see increased student basic needs insecurity combined with the increased cost of college attendance. 47% of community college students are experiencing food insecurity, and 36% of four-year college students are experiencing food insecurity. Next slide, please. So we talk about focusing on the SNAP program because of its reach. SNAP is also an entitlement program. That means that enrollment expands with need, which is an example of good program design. It's called countercyclical. So in an economic downturn, when people are experiencing job loss or financial hardship, SNAP enrollment is designed to increase to respond to that. And SNAP recipients are, or at least should be, a target demographic for many of the occupations and many of the completion goals that we are targeting. That number by BLS that is predicted to grow to 2031 is approximately 55.6 million occupations that will require post-secondary credential beyond high school by 2031. And we know we're about 7 million people short of having college degrees to reach our national attainment rate. Meanwhile, SNAP recipients that have a high school diploma or an equivalent such as a GED with no degree are about 13.8 million people. And this is one of the things we do when we do state technical assistance, is to try to get the higher education agencies, the human services agencies, and the workforce development people in the room to see and understand the overlap in the shared population and to identify and remove the policy barriers that prevent those shared goals. Next slide. And we think about the adult educational attainment of SNAP recipients. This is the breakdown. So we can see SNAP recipients that have no high school diploma in 2020 were about 23%. And among that high school diploma or GED and some college no degree, that's 58.6% of SNAP recipients. As I said before, about 13.8 million people. And then associate's degree holders are about 8.3%, with bachelor's degree or higher being close to 10%. That number has increased slowly over time during the pandemic, the number of people with degrees that are on SNAP. And I was really curious about what might be behind this, because I was in a conversation with somebody recently talking about our policy recommendations, and the persistent fear exists that people who look temporarily low income while they're in college will get SNAP when they don't deserve it, continues to come up in conversations, regardless that there are really no data to suggest that this is a risk. And it's this sort of anecdotal fear or the perception that we're really combating. So I wanted to understand, who are these people with bachelor's degrees? Because we know each successive level of education achieved results in higher income, lower unemployment, lower poverty rates, better access to employer-paid healthcare and retirement. So I really wanted to understand this population. Next slide, please. And what I found was that SNAP recipients with bachelor's degrees are more likely to be women, they're more likely to be Black or Hispanic, they're more likely to be divorced or separated, and they're more likely to be caring for a child under the age of 18. And there's really no surprise that, I think a high correlation of this demographic is that Black and Hispanic women have the largest gender and wage gap. So even among those holding bachelor's degrees who are receiving SNAP, they're paid less than their white counterparts and their male counterparts. I think this is important context. Next slide, please. And then when we think about how do state college completion goals align with SNAP recipients, and on this right-hand side of the chart are all of the states who have college completion goals. The green bars are the states that are explicitly targeting adults ages 25 to 64 or even ages 25 and over. And among that demographic of SNAP recipients, that's 70% or 16.6 million SNAP recipients that could be helping those states achieve those college completion goals. Next slide, please. So in doing the SNAP Reimagined analysis, our hypothesis was that higher education and SNAP are not well aligned, which don't really think is a surprise to anyone, particularly in this conversation. And also that maybe the SNAP exemptions tied to FAFSA may not well reflect SNAP eligibility. And that a reduction and simplification of the post-secondary restrictions would have the greatest impact. So what we found in our analysis is that in fact, FAFSA and SNAP are not well aligned, FAFSA being the primary way that higher education assesses need in the aid of grants and loans, and that there are key discrepancies not only in age differences and who is included in a household, but also independent type statuses such as being a veteran, or being unmarried. And then a SNAP household is essentially a group of people who buy and prepare food together. So there are some key discrepancies here that when we even think about whose income is included, what people are included, what is the household size, that FAFSA and SNAP are misaligned in key ways. Similarly, we see that FAFSA timing does not align with SNAP eligibility. And I just want to call out that there was an incorrect version of this graphic in the report previously. It has since been updated, but if for some reason you downloaded an earlier version of the analysis, we recommend you go back and get the refreshed run with the correct timeline here. And we know FAFSA uses prior year income data. So by the time a person starts taking classes, say this fall, or even is experiencing hardship during the spring of 2024, we see that their income data could be up to 3 years old, whereas the SNAP program assesses income eligibility in the prior 30 days. And given what we know about many students with lower incomes and from marginalized backgrounds, there is more fluctuation in their income, in their household makeup, in their living circumstances that can force students to miss key indicators if we are tying SNAP eligibility to FAFSA data, because FAFSA affects a lot of things. Dependency status, which controls whose income is included, which affects EFC, work study eligibility, in addition to things like C campus, as well as other things. And we know the process for getting a dependency status or EFC updated isn't straightforward, and students with some of the greatest stressors and greatest barriers to basic needs and post-secondary access and completion often have the least knowledge and social capital to be able to access some of the programs that require an audit or an update to their financial aid status. Next slide, please. So what we did then was to look at what student exemptions, particularly ones that I feel like have been part of the dialogue about what could potentially help students, and want to give Congress a lot of credit for trying to identify ways to expand eligibility to students during the pandemic to improve their access and reduce their food insecurity, and really wanted to understand what do the data say about who falls under different expected family contributions, and how does that relate to SNAP eligibility. So federal SNAP eligibility is limited to 130% of the federal poverty level, but states have a policy option called broad-based categorical eligibility to raise that income limit all the way up to 200% of the federal poverty level, and 34 states have actually done so. So you can see under 130% of the federal poverty level, EFC does capture about 87% of those students, but is also missing some students that could be eligible for SNAP if we raise that expected family contribution limit up. And particularly, there are large swaths of students in the 130% to 200% poverty level in 34 states that would be getting missed if we set the expected family contribution as low as 0. And the other exemption that we looked at was the 20-hour per week work exemption. There's a lot of confusion around the student exemptions. This is mostly to blame in the Food and Nutrition Act. It's sort of written backwards that the student exemptions actually confer eligibility, but they confer eligibility because they exempt a student from disqualification. So this is why we call them student exemptions and not student eligibility. The 20-hour per week exemption essentially says if you are working on average 20 hours a week, you could be eligible for SNAP through this particular exemption. And work requirements have and should receive a lot of criticism. The data show that they're incredibly harmful, that they don't improve well-being, they don't improve access to employment. But the 20-hour a week student exemption works a little bit differently. And so we wanted to understand who could potentially be benefiting from that 20-hour a week exemption. And we see that students who are independent, who are low income, and who are students of color are more likely to be working. And we can see that part-time students are working on average, certainly more than their full-time students. So looking at whether the 20-hour a week work exemption is something that can be tweaked or improved on is certainly an important policy discussion, but we want to make sure that we're not removing an exemption for people who could be benefiting without making sure they have another pathway to confer their eligibility. Next slide, please. I just want to say really quickly that for all of the student exemptions, those apply specifically to the student population who is enrolled at least half-time. Everybody who applies for SNAP must first meet income, household, and citizenship criteria, regardless of what your FAFSA data says, regardless of how many hours that you're working. Everybody has to meet both gross and net income limits to be eligible for SNAP. So then SNAP says, okay, are you enrolled at least half-time? Yes, you could be eligible for a student exemption. If no, you could still receive SNAP, but you would be eligible, you would be subjected to one or both of SNAP's work requirements. So I just want to make it very clear that when we're talking about expanding the student exemptions, it does not expand eligibility because SNAP already has very stringent income, citizenship, and household requirements. What we're doing is trying to identify a better way to capture student eligibility and need through that process. And then when we would think about the student federal work study exemption, there's also a provision for a state work study exemption. Very few states have state-funded work study programs, so it's really not a well-targeted exemption. And similarly, when we look at federal work study allocations disproportionately benefit established and high-cost, especially private institutions, due in part to the federal allocation formula that distributes work study funds based on how much a school has received in the past. So a student from a household with a relatively high income can still have unmet financial need simply because they're enrolled at an institution that has a higher cost of attendance, while students from marginalized and poverty impacted communities are the least likely to enroll in private four-year institutions and so are the least likely to benefit from federal work study. Similarly, public two-year colleges enroll about half of undergraduates, yet receive only about 20% of federal work study funds. And private four-year institutions enroll 14% of undergraduate students, but receive 38% of federal work study funds. So as a result, a student at a private four-year institution with the highest income has about a 12% chance of receiving federal work study, while the lowest income students at public four-year institutions and community colleges have a 10 and 5% chance respectively. Because of this allocation of federal work study funds, that largely excludes community colleges and institutions serving more economically disadvantaged students, we think that this exemption is fairly limited in its reach to provide SNAP access for the students who are most likely to qualify. And so our policy recommendations, as I said, are based in both our understanding of the federal program and the complexities of it, as well as the understanding and perspective of having done state technical assistance. and food and nutrition services, state higher education systems, institutions, students. Everybody consistently says that these student eligibility rules are among the most complex and confusing to try to understand and connect students to. So eliminating or significantly simplifying the post-secondary restrictions would go far, and including post-secondary attendance and activities that meet participation requirements. Currently, that is not the case unless you're a student who's enrolled half-time. And one of the biggest glaring holes that we think exists currently in the Food and Nutrition Act that needs to be remedied, is that post-secondary credentials are not included in definitions of employment and training. And this is a bipartisan fix that can ensure that state efforts are maximized, that SNAP is able to support federal and state investments in higher education, college completion goals, are able to support institutions and their ability to re-enroll and enroll people who are trying to pursue a post-secondary credential or who never have and could engage in the system. And it's really important to clarify that because everyone has to go through SNAP's income, citizenship, and household criteria, and that those rules are very stringent, SNAP does not increase, these changes to the student rules do not increase the number of people eligible for SNAP. These people are already income eligible and have been getting their access restricted due to the complexity of the student rules. Similarly, there's very low risk of increased waste, fraud, or abuse from simplifying the student eligibility restrictions. Since the student eligibility restrictions were put into place in 1977, there have been 6 statutorily mandated forms of verification that have been included to verify SNAP application information. And in addition to that, caseworkers have the ability to call and follow up on specific pieces of information. SNAP does also not create dependency, whether it's for the student restrictions or any other form of SNAP, and it does not increase SNAP costs because these people are already eligible. And we know that improving access to SNAP improves the long-term economic security of SNAP recipients, leads to better employment outcomes, and reduces reliance on SNAP. So our key takeaways here are that post-secondary education is demonstrably the best workforce development program, and programs that focus on, and frankly, resources that funnel federal and state dollars into employment and training programs that show little to no demonstrable effect while eliminating access to post-secondary credentials are counterproductive. And that many SNAP recipients are or could be trying to complete a college credential, but they are facing too many barriers. And that federal programs should facilitate and not restrict access to pathways that achieve self-sufficiency. Great. That concludes our program for today. Thank you all very much for joining. We will be sending out a follow-up recording of the webinar. And as we mentioned previously, if there are questions in the chat, we will make sure that we follow up with those specifically for people individually. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.